The U.S. has announced a shift in its policy towards Beijing's claims to offshore resources in the South China Sea. The hotly contested body of water is a key shipping route and an abundant fishing area. It's also one of the biggest sticking points in China's relationship with neighboring countries. Ian Bremmer is joining us now to talk more about why the new U.S. position is significant and what it could mean for the region. Ian, it's so great to see you again. So let's start with the basics. What claims is Beijing making towards the parts of the South China Sea, and how have other countries in the region responded to those claims?
They're claiming that they have exclusive territorial rights, both in terms of military access as well as resource exploitation. And if you look at those demands on a map, they basically run from China's shelf all the way up to the borders of these South China Sea countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia. It's a pretty staggering, there you've got the map. You can see that, I mean, there's obviously no justification for these claims, aside from the fact that China is the dominant economic trading partner with all of these countries, and also is the dominant military partner in the region, even though the United States outguns the Chinese globally. And so that's meant that a lot of countries have tried to find ways to buy the Chinese off, not get them too angry, engage one-on-one, as opposed to taking on a multilateral perspective with the United States.
So then what does the new U.S. position mean for its involvement in the region? When the Trump administration, first began, there was this whole America First thing, and Donald Trump really wanted to sort of pull out of the region. What's happening now?
I mean, it is an escalation. The Obama administration was unwilling to recognize the court at The Hague's ruling because they thought it was going to be too controversial. President Trump, the Trump administration now doing that, certainly formally says that China's claims are not recognized by the United States. It paves the way for the Americans to engage in more military operations, shadowing Chinese military operations in the region, as well as their drilling ships, for example, their fishing vessels, many of which are supported by the Chinese military, also implies that the United States will be flying more missions through there. So it raises the military stakes. But I mean, it's not just on the South China Seas. I'm sure you know, in pretty much every area of U.S.-Chinese relations right now, technology, economics and trade, intellectual property, cyber, even the Uyghurs, human rights issues, something Trump hasn't exactly taken up assertively over his first term. The U.S.-China relationship has become more contentious. The relations are becoming more hostile. So I would see this decision by President Trump very much as part of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. The example of the Trump administration taking steps in defiance of Beijing has happened several times over the past couple of weeks, Ian. So I guess the question becomes, how does the U.S.-China relationship currently stand? I mean, the president, every day when he talks about the coronavirus, his big talking point is putting a ban in from China, which, most experts say didn't really change a whole lot in how the virus is spreading here in the United States now, currently. At one point, though, early in the pandemic, he praised Xi Jinping. So it's so hard to decipher what the relationship is currently between the United States and China.
Well, first of all,
he has a way of complimenting Xi Jinping while also criticizing the country of China, almost as if they're separate.
That's right.
That's right. That's a good point, Amber.
That was because he really wanted the Phase 1 China trade deal to stay in place, even as he criticizes China, because he understands that putting more tariffs on Chinese goods in a run-up to the election where Americans are taking on the chin, unemployment is massive, and the economy is contracting, is not exactly going to help him in the polls. So that's part of it. And we know that Trump personally has an orientation towards the strong man. President Putin in Russia, President Erdogan in Turkey, President Duterte in the Philippines, and President Xi in China. But the U.S.-China relationship overall is clearly becoming more confrontational. It is not just about the U.S. Also, many allies of the U.S. are having problems with China right now. It's not being driven by President Trump. Australia in a trade war with the Chinese because Australia calling on the Chinese to open investigations into the initial cover-up of coronavirus. We have the Canadians who had engaged in supporting this U.S. extradition of the daughter of the Huawei CEO and founder, and the Chinese have held and tortured a couple of Canadian ex-diplomats as a consequence of that. In India, you've got a fight with the Chinese in the Himalayas. And so just 2 weeks ago, India banned TikTok and 58 other Chinese apps. The United Kingdom just decided they were going to flip and ban Huawei from 5G, despite the fact that Boris Johnson was trying to get more Chinese investment into nuclear plants and into rail infrastructure. I mean, actually, this has been the worst year for Xi Jinping imaginable, despite the fact that their economy is actually regrowing faster than any other major economy in the world. Internationally, China's on a really tough footing right now, and their relationship with the United States is actually only part of that.
So, Ian, before I let you go, how do the Chinese view the United States? Because as Anne-Marie points out, and as you sort of clarified, the president of the United States oftentimes praises Xi Jinping. According to John Bolton in that book that all of Washington and perhaps a lot of other people have read also, John Bolton, the former national security advisor, claims that in a private meeting with Xi Jinping, President Trump encouraged Xi Jinping to build those internment camps, which back in June, the Trump administration signed sanctions because the Chinese were incarcerating Uyghurs. And he encouraged Xi Jinping, according to Bolton, to do these things because he wanted this trade deal to move forward, which would have helped America's farmers, which he believes would have helped him with his reelection. So with those two different, like, sort of schisms, I guess, how do the Chinese view the U.S. and perhaps Trump? I mean, I don't know. Are those two separate viewpoints?
Well, they're very separate in terms of timing. I mean, at the time, President Trump was supporting getting this phase one trade deal. Right now, blaming China is a very significant piece of Trump's reelection campaign, not least because he's otherwise mishandled coronavirus, and China and their cover-up of human-to-human transmission, not just with the U.S., but the World Health Organization, China's own people, the world for the first month, is a very serious problem. So, I mean, they're consistent if you're not looking for an overall policy strategy for Trump, but recognize that his policy orientations are quite tactical. They're reactionary, and they're focusing on his interests at the time. So it's not like China has to be an enemy or an ally. It's, is China useful to President Trump when we're talking? And right now, China is not. Let's be clear. Right now, the single biggest agreement in foreign policy, bipartisan, in the United States is a hawkish policy on China. You had a vote 2 weeks ago in Senate, 100-0, in going after Chinese officials and institutions for the imposition of a national security law in Hong Kong. You can't get 100-0 in Senate on anything. So in this election period, the next 4 months, you're going to see a Trump administration and the United States escalating in their confrontation towards China. And if Biden wins in November, I don't think that U.S.-China relations are suddenly getting better. This is a changed orientation for U.S. policy in the world.
All right, Ian Bremmer, as always, so great to talk to you, Ian. Stay safe.
You too, guys. See ya.